Hello, fellow marketeers, brand builders and designers, data scientists, and insights folks. Today, we're talking about packaging, the most underrated part of marketing. And as Dr. William Caruso, our guest for today, will say, it is indeed one of the P's and as such has an important part in the mix. So today we're talking to Dr. William Caruso. Dr. William Caruso from the Ehrenberg-Bass Institute from the Adelaide University in South Australia is the leading scientist on packaging, marketing scientist that is. So welcome, Will.
Great to be on, and I hope I can not just entertain your listeners, but also leave them with some bite-sized knowledge to basically make better informed redesign decisions. That's my goal with all the research that I do.
Bravo, Dr. Will. So to immediately perhaps ask the most important question, can good packaging redesign increase sales?
A good redesign in isolation is not going to increase your sales. Essentially, if you think about what packaging doesn't create demand. Packaging facilitates purchase. So from a consumer perspective, you've got to know the brand, and then you've got packaging there that facilitates that choice. If you redesign that pack, you're making some type of change. So if you're doing that in isolation, just making a change, you're inherently decreasing that familiarity, and that's going to obviously create confusion. But on that point, packaging redesigns never happen in isolation. Never. There's always some type of marketing support. So if we go on that perspective, it's like, I would say 50-50, but your odds of when you do a redesign to actually have some success drastically increase with that marketing support, whatever that might be. But on the other end, if you don't have any marketing support, redesigns can decrease sales. That's something really, really to worry about.
So this is super interesting what you say, and especially for our listeners that are perhaps squeezed on budget or don't have any support to put behind redesign. Without any marketing support, perhaps we should rethink the redesign. So does it make sense to do a redesign?
Yeah, well, it depends what your kind of issue is. So if you want to be successful, you need to look at things like mental and physical availability support for that brand. So it's not just, okay, if we're doing this redesign in isolation, if we only do that, probably going to have a bad time. But if you're doing that redesign and it gets you some more distribution somewhere, it might be, okay, we might be on a special display, or it might increase some shelf presence. So
yes,
we're redesigning our product and we include some type of point of sale. Also, in actual fact, if we redesign, we get more people in our organization talking about the brand and the packaging.
And that's so
just
true
by
as well.
thinking about it, they make those better decisions. Yeah, so
it shows the value of redesign in the big marketing mix, if you want to call it that way. And that I've seen it myself often, that is, a redesign is a good hook for a campaign, and it's a good hook to talk to the retailers, and a good hook to get a new SKU listed, or to have, one or two more facings on the shelf that will help you there.
Exactly right.
Or to have some new space for online marketing. So
exactly.
Super. And it's some of your latest research you mentioned, published by Adelaide, that packaging modernization impacts purchasing attention through aesthetic appeal. I found that such a beautiful, specific phrase with some beautiful words in it, such as aesthetic appeal. So what do you mean with that?
Aesthetic appeal is what marketers actually mean when they mean by we're going to modernize our product. It talks about the terms of how consumers perceive some visual attractiveness, but it aligns with what they expect to be relevant in that category. I just think it's a better definition of modernity, to be honest.
Okay.
But that's going to be very hard to convince everyone. But if we talk about aesthetic appeal, it gets more people to understand it's not just kind of purely about the design quality.
Mm-hmm.
It's more to do with how the pack is processed in terms of clarity. Is it coherent? Is it familiar? It's kind of a perceptual driver that works alongside familiarity and recognizability. Because if you talk about if someone's aesthetically pleasing to someone, it then means, like, what does that mean for that person? And okay, it could be it's familiar and we recognize it. That's what, in terms of most designers or even marketers talk about when they mean modernization. Because if you just look at modernization by itself, what does that actually mean? That could mean anything in multiple different concepts. So I've kind of pushed and tried to understand modernization. Let's start talking about aesthetic appeal.
Interesting, interesting. So we have aesthetic appeal or modernization, and then you talked about familiarity,
Yep.
another axis or driver, right?
Yeah, so familiarity, coherence, and clarity. So let's talk about in terms of a pack. So
Yeah.
clarity means, does someone, when they see that, does it represent what we want them to, obviously what it represents? So that could be clarity in branding, or it could be clarity in messaging. Do we want someone to know that this brand is ours? And do we obviously want a message attached to it, what that variant or flavor is? So that's about clarity. Coherence is, does it fit with what consumers expect us to look like? And that's when you start talking about what are those other things that might be in their mind? Well, we can call them distinctive assets if they are strong, or shopping assets. What
Hmm.
does someone expect this to look like? And that could come from two ways. It could be in terms of familiarity. So,
Hmm.
does that asset represent the brand? Or the second point is, does that actually represent the category? There is some cases where the packaging might look like a bottle of water, but if you start
Yes.
putting water in, I don't know, a flask, say, and it's in a
Yes. Yes. Yes.
box and it looks like maybe wine, for example, you've got to teach people that that device actually means that category. Kind of an
Interesting.
interesting one if you think about milk in, I think it was the Canadian market, they actually sell
Yeah.
it in plastic bags, which to me, seeing that milk, no milk carton,
Yeah.
kind of, yeah,
Yes.
it stood
Yeah.
out as
Yeah.
a bit confusing. But it
Yeah.
makes the idea of it needs some coherence with what people might expect that product to actually look like.
Well, you often see that in marketing that, marketers with rebranding and now based on that also with packaging, as you rightly pointed out, go too far and through repackaging place themselves outside of the category, if you will. So outside of what people would associate
Hmm.
with the category, such as cartons and milk.
Exactly. It's always a bit of a balance. So when you've got your designer coming in or even a marketer, just thinking about packaging from a bit of a different angle, if you've got to quantify or put things into different buckets, it's like, well, what are our creative devices on our pack? Those are the things that could, in terms of aesthetic appeal. But then you've got other things that are more mandatory. You've got to have branding devices on there. Otherwise, what's the point? You just work on, if you're available, someone's going to pick you up. You might as well be a private label, for example. But
Yeah.
even then they build their own brands. But then you've got other things like your messaging devices. So those three key areas, creative, branding, and messaging. And then you've
Yeah.
got things that fit under them for each brand. And it's not always the same elements for each category and each brand. Because depending on how you've built your brand, you've got different elements that can represent the brand.
So that's interesting. And you mentioned earlier a little bit something about distinctive assets and shopper assets. Is there a
Okay.
difference between them?
Yes. So when we talk about shopping assets, those are assets that facilitate shopping in a way. So they might be more or less messaging devices that could just show the category. Like I don't really have a link to a brand, but from a distance, I see a packet of chips or an egg carton, for example. I know that there's going to be eggs in there. Well, I would hope there would be eggs in there,
Yeah.
but they're those things that people use when shopping to represent the category. Distinctive assets is kind of a subset of shopping assets. It's when you're within the category, what things represent the brand to the majority of consumers. And that's when I said before, things get a bit different. It really depends on what the brand has used in the past and being consistent to determine what necessarily is a distinctive asset. Because if you look at the chip aisle in any given country, if I was just to show you a silver bag of crisps or chips, whatever you want to call them, most people would just say, okay, that could be any brand. But then when you start adding your distinctive assets on it, and obviously different for different categories, some colors for categories just mean flavors, but others they
Hmm.
might actually be those branding devices. So that's kind of the difference. Shopping assets are a combination of everything. Your distinctive
Okay.
assets are your subset of assets that facilitate shopping, but help you as a marketer or even designer to make your redesign stand out or make sure that that redesign increases or maintains that familiarity.
Interesting. And now that you research all this and have all this information, how do you research it? How do you measure something? For instance, how do you measure aesthetic appeal?
If I was to talk about how I would measure aesthetic appeal, the first thing I would like sit down and think about, well, if we think of aesthetic appeal in terms of, let's just think about it as modernization. It's in 60%
Mm-hmm.
of marketing briefs. I think it's in 80% of the top two if you look at objectives for redesigns. It's always up there, but if we look at aesthetic appeal in terms of like modernization, let's just call it how attractive it might be or how relevant it might be. But when we want to measure that, we want to look at asking our consumers simple questions on how relevant is this to you? Does it appeal to you? Or how likable is it? But you always need to look at aesthetic appeal in terms of not just you, but your competitors. Because unfortunately, if you look at yourself in isolation, you might think a score of 4 out of 10 is bad for aesthetic appeal. But if you're in a category that is not appealing as the big categories like chocolate, chips, or the ones that spend a lot of money on advertising, but if you're in a category like soap, for
Yeah,
example,
yeah.
aesthetic appeal might just be lower as a category in general. So it's always good to benchmark with aesthetic appeal. I would look at likability, recognition, and
Yeah.
familiarity. Those three key concepts.
Like Dr. Will, you say so many
Yeah.
interesting things just between the lines. Huh? So you mentioned that it's how much they like it is very much
Mhm.
depending on the category as well.
Yeah.
So that means you'll have higher scores if you do the same research for chocolate bars than for
Yeah.
soap bars on this.
Yeah,
And that means you have
exactly
to,
right.
yeah, and that means you have to benchmark it. And I suppose you benchmark it against the competition.
Exactly right. Always benchmarking against the competition, but then you also have to benchmark between what you're actually asking someone because we then see differences in naturally characters score higher than colors. Because if you ask someone, how much do you like purple? Well, yeah, cool. I don't
Yeah.
like purple. I like blue. Like, but if you're asking that across all of the categories, maybe likability doesn't matter for that because it's not something that people need to like. But purple for some brands is a distinctive asset. And that's when familiarity or even recognition to the brand comes more important. So that's why I say always look at it in terms of those three constructs to look at aesthetic appeal. But you don't need to
Interesting.
have high on all of them. You need to really
Yeah.
understand how your category, one, fits in with consumers, but two, what has been consistent over time, then you really need to not change.
This is so interesting. Now,
Yeah.
in my own research, I've always seen, but perhaps that's my research, that
Yeah.
likability somehow correlates to familiarity. So when you research
Yeah.
something and it's familiar, they like it more.
That's the mere exposure effect. So that's
Yeah.
the kind of, if we're going to jump down the academic kind of understanding of theories, that's if you keep showing someone something and they become familiar with it, naturally
Uh-huh.
they're going to like it more. If you see a brand constantly, it's very well known, it's consistent, generally you will have higher likability. And it's even in terms of the distinctive assets for brands too. The more well recognized they are, the slightly higher they have likability compared to things that I knew.
Now, earlier on, you
Yeah.
mentioned redesign can actually have a negative effect or not effect. Now, when you mention it, can this redesign have a negative effect because it has no effect at all? So you just waste your time, you waste your money, you waste your energy, or can it actually put people off that you have that
Yeah,
your sales go down?
it could be multiple different things. So it really depends on what the reason for that redesign is for you to determine whether or not it was actually negative. We obviously see when you look at design awards or things like that, that a negative redesign decreases sales. But that's obviously a clear negative. But there's other hidden things that we might consider actually to be um, a negative. Like we don't have any change. And we've spent actually a lot of money on this. It was internally driven by staff, as much as
Yes.
marketers don't want to say that. It might be internally driven. We expected it to have this big increase, but it did nothing. So that's obviously a negative.
That's
If you're looking at terms of, okay, we're going to do something really novel and try to like be incredibly different because a competitor's done it and it looks successful for them. If you try and do it and it's not successful, or it is successful, but it's not as successful as you thought, there could also be a lot of wasted resources. So packaging's one of those areas that I guess it is one of the four Ps for a reason. It facilitates
yes.
purchase, and once you start playing with that, it can be very dangerous for you. So
Yes.
even a small change can have drastic effects.
So and basically you should always test.
Yes, of some type. Test, even testing your perception of what you think your distinctive assets are. A little bit, not exactly on the packaging area, but distinctive assets in general. Marketing managers tend to overestimate the relative strength of their distinctive assets. So it's super important because you see your brand every day. Remember, I said mere exposure and likability and familiarity. You're not your consumer. And that's
Well,
what we also see when these redesigns happen. Sometimes they think, well, because we think this is really strong, let's not change it. Or they think it's really like strong and familiar, and they think maybe that's boring. And then that obviously works the other way. So
so,
it's always
so,
super important to test.
so I would even take your words and make them stronger. Not only do marketeers overestimate the distinctive brand estimates, I think they overestimate the brand itself totally. And obviously, the distinctive brand estimates are part is they really think the brand matters more to the lives of their consumers than it really does. There are very, very few brands that I've seen that actually have this impact from that people cherish. I mean, there is no such thing as love brands. Perhaps
Yeah,
one or two.
exactly. Yeah, exactly
Yes.
right. So there's always exceptions to the rule, but as I said before, like packaging by itself, remember when I said a change won't increase sales? When we look
Yeah.
at all these other things that redesigns might do or packaging can do, that's when it could actually increase your sales. So it's always a super, super hard area, this reader. If someone asks me if I'm going to redesign my packaging, will it be successful? Well, yes and no.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
metric are you even using to determine success? And that's
Yes.
another question entirely.
So we talked about redesign and packaging. How about seasonal packaging? Like everybody always gets onto the seasonal boat, especially with Christmas, a little bit with Easter, but also in other parts of the world, with the Ramadan, Chinese New Year, that we're all redesigning our packaging for that. Does
Mhm.
that help? Is it worthwhile?
I'm gonna be for sure, but it needs to
Yeah.
be done in a way that seasonal, because obviously in those seasons, if you're not creating a Christmas product, if you're not creating something for Halloween, and you're in one of those categories that sales increases a lot, you're going to be left behind because people will pick some design that's a Halloween one if they're giving it as a gift or giving it out and it's at Halloween. If you're missing that key occasion and everyone else is doing it, unfortunately you will have to do it. But you should really, to be successful in those, you design your seasonal variants to look like your ones that are on the shelf the rest of the year. So if, for example, it's given as a gift, someone might buy it for the first time at that point in time. It's good to have them make those links that this chocolate or this product or this milk or whatever it is around all the rest of the 11 months of the year. And then it obviously helps build your core. But we often see brands design so much for the occasion that they forget about their brand. So it's like at
Oh,
Christmas, if you're saying, oh, I'm going to just give someone Christmas chocolate, well, okay, well, but what brand is it? If they're just saying Christmas chocolate, they don't even know it's on the shelf the rest of the year. But if like you're giving someone Christmas chocolate and they can see that it's got those brand cues related to that brand's actually using that to their advantage.
so seasonal occasions are great. They can help you
Yep.
tap into an additional occasions, or otherwise you're left
Yep.
out, but
Yeah.
not at the expense of your distinctive assets.
Exactly right. And in terms of retailer presence too, majority of packaging is sold still in brick and mortar stores. So retailers, when it's Christmas time, create all those extra displays because They think if they've got the best looking Christmas store that more customers will come in there compared to their competitors. And they don't really care which brand they sell, A or B. They just
Yes,
say,
yes, yes.
okay, you're offering us a Christmas offering. We're going to give you the best space for it. So it is a bit of a balance too. You're not just doing it for customers, you're also redesigning your pack for the actual retailer to get you that presence. And we know if you've got more physical availability within the store, you're found in aisle and on a display, naturally you're going to get sold more as
Yes,
well. So that's not even
yes.
about the design. That's just about having more shelf facings.
That's so true. But you can use design to
Yeah,
get that. And
exactly.
as such, basically, redesign becomes more of a B2B marketing tool for your
Yeah.
own retailers, for your own channel to get that shelf space, or the person responsible for the shelf space to get more presence there. Also, you mentioned if redesign is so tricky and if redesign has to be better embedded in so much other marketing initiatives, you wonder what is the reason people are really doing all these redesigns? I sometimes wonder that perhaps this is more done for eternal reasons, for
Mm.
perhaps ego reasons, than for the redesign itself.
Yeah, there's lots of different reasons. The number one reason why redesigns occur is it to be modern. However, when we look at who says it needs to be more modern, often that comes from the marketing department more than the customers themselves.
Yes, 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 yeah,
So
yeah.
that's something to like just keep in mind. As I said before, you see, well, brand managers see their packs every day, and customers have one of 100 different packs maybe in their pantry. I'm not going to say it's being bored, but it's maybe overestimating what a redesign can do because maybe you made a redesign or a brand manager's made some type of redesign in the past and it worked really, really well.
Yeah, yeah.
From the research I do, I don't really care what a brand did to do well. I look at all the redesigns that have happened and see, well, what reasons actually are successful and help make good redesigns versus bad ones.
Super. Now, another point that we touched on, which I find
Yeah.
incredibly interesting, cultural differences and packaging. Now, looking at cultural differences is actually one of my specialties. As you perhaps know, I've done a lot of research in differences in culture, how this affects marketing, how this affects branding. But how does this play out in packaging?
Cultural differences are very, very important for messaging. If we look at packaging as a branding device, which is what I've kind of been looking at it through our chat, it's a little bit less important, but it still needs to be there. Like you might have different symbols that are interpreted differently in different markets.
Hmm.
Obviously, if the language isn't English, you need to change your packaging into a completely different language. And maybe retail environments in terms of cultural effectiveness, you might need to change your packaging to better fit into that retail environment. But if we talk about cultural differences in packaging, is it's often overestimated by
I totally
marketers.
agree.
It needs to be there, but you can find that packaging can be quite consistent and might only need small little adaptations for each market. You don't need to drastically create a new pack or a new design for each market, but some things in some markets do make a difference. But if you just think about countries. If you've got two countries right next to each other and they're probably very similar cultural values and the advertising's been quite similar for the same time, probably the same pack can work. But if you've got a country in Europe and then you're looking in China and you've got completely different competitive sets and maybe the brand's launching into China for the first time, you're probably not going to use English characters on pack. So you're going to have to change it into the local language so people can obviously read it. But then other things that, unless it really has some cultural irrelevance, still can be consistent. So you still could use the color, the actual font style, the picture of the same product, but you'd only really, really change it if for some reason there's something there that people hate for whatever reason.
It makes a lot of sense. Packaging is a branding tool, a tool to bring the distinctive assets straight to the shopper floor, to the consumer. And these
Yeah.
should be the same in all markets. And what
Yeah.
I've seen as a cultural researcher is that it matters a lot when you come to communication, the look and feel, the underlying message. But that's not what packaging is about. How people perceive packaging is surprisingly universal. You do have to research the symbolism of your distinctive assets, the associations people have, the colors, certain
or even
mascots or
characters. Yeah,
icons or animals. But that is looking at more at the interpretation of certain aspects of your packaging, but it
exactly.
doesn't need to be different. And you can even
No.
state stronger. I mean, if you make it different, that means that all your other communication in which you use your packaging has to be done different. And you can do nothing centrally. It means everything has to be adapted to the local market, which drives up all your communication costs and all your production costs.
Yeah, exactly right. If you're launching into a new market and you're changing everything, you might as well just use a new brand. Like, what's the
Yes.
point of if you want to change everything? And I
Yeah.
think on your point too, it's cultural assumptions in general, I think sometimes too often guide decision making when they just need to be tested. Do they actually exist or not? Do we
Exactly.
think maybe something's
Yeah.
more culturally relevant? And if a designer or a team overestimates something, let's just test it, because if we think too much about cultural difference, it creates a really big complex situation, and then it makes it even
It,
harder to actually do that design.
it does. It does. Testing is so much more cost effective, so much easier, and reduces the complexity of all the decisions and the
Mhm.
processes later on so much. So that makes all the sense in the world. Just test it and then
Yeah,
see.
exactly.
And now, a brick and mortar. You mentioned it earlier on in our conversation. So, how important is it to stand out on the shelf, or is it overhyped?
Oh, this is an interesting question because it's on it. Every marketer would have thought about this at some point. Like, what's the benefit of us standing out, being thought of first, rather than looking like us? Like, if we look like us and we kind of fit in, is that a disadvantage of basically standing out? So standing out is necessary, but it's not insufficient if you kind of don't do it. There is kind of just a balance. So if you think that your brand or a lot of the brands are in, as I said, maybe, I don't know, your brand's really known for being purple. We'll use purple
Yeah,
as an
yeah.
example. Everyone can think of probably what brands I'm talking about. But you've got like a really, really big range. You have the shelf, you look consistent. Yes, you've got visibility from a distance, but you think, I'm launching a new SKU. It's this new flavor. It's got its own advertising campaign behind it. We really want this to be successful. How then do we make it stand out? Well, it's quite easily. I could just change the color. If everything's purple and I want to, let's make this pink, completely different. Yes, it's going to stand out, but in terms of overall recognizability or familiarity in the long run, that's going to be detrimental to you because it creates that added confusion. And when you do that, essentially, why would you create confusion for yourself? Your competitors are already doing that anyway. That's why standing out really important. But I would say let's just forget about standing out and let's talk about simplicity and clarity. So if we can
Yes.
make our product as quick to for people to understand and it means us, and it's quite simple and easy to do that. If you can see it from a distance, not necessarily has to stand out, but you just know that, okay, well, that shape means this brand, and it's quite simple and quick to do that. That's actually standing out in the mind of the shopper rather than standing out on shelf. And I'm going to say standing out in the mind is more important than standing out on shelf. Because, as I said before, stand out on shelf, easy. But standing out in the mind of those people buying you is a lot harder. And that's probably what is more
I'm
effective.
going to quote you on that. It's more important
Okay.
to stand out in the mind than stand out on the shelf. And
Yep.
forget about standing out on the shelf. Focus on simplicity and clarity. Those are
Yep.
beautiful words. And going down to something similar to that, POC material. This is something that, in my opinion, is very much overlooked in the marketing material. So the marketing on the shopper floor. And what you can do
Yeah.
here, I mean, there are some brands such as M&M's which do this amazingly beautiful. But for
Yeah.
most other brands, you can wonder if it has been given enough attention.
Point of sale material is an area that I have done a lot of research in. It was actually the kind of area of my master's research, which was looking at
Oh,
shopper
how
behavior and
interesting.
how they interacted with not just point of sale, but it was looking at end caps. But the same idea was it was looking at when you've got point of sale, the whole idea of that is to make your brand stand out. Like, so you add something extra. It might be a shelf talker, it might be a something on the floor in terms of like, we've even seen like advertisements on the floor. It could be something to do with the bay. It could be actually a display. Like that's actually point of sale. But Why it's so effective is because normally when you do some type of point of sale, it increases the visibility of your brand. And by doing that, generally it increases those short-term sales. But why I think it's often overlooked is because it's not, I guess maybe it's might not be as cost effective as some other things. When people look at, okay, if we're going to advertise, or it's an advertising medium, like essentially shopper media, if you
Yeah.
want to call it. But if you look at something like we could easily run something on social media that's quite a bit easier, where if you're doing something at point of sale, someone has to go in the store and actually do it.
Yeah,
You have
yeah.
to get permission from the retailer to do it. It might cost a bit more, but it's kind of going back to good old-fashioned marketing. I think that's more effective in terms of
Yeah.
building your physical availability, and you don't even need to redesign your brand to do that. It's
Yes.
going back to we create some type of attention for our product. It's in the store. It's right before shoppers make that decision. And yeah, as I said before, it's helping your brand stand out, but it's not necessarily making it stand out by being different. It's that's when it can help stand out in your mind because your packaging's the exact same. It's just doing something else to create that attention in terms of standout, not necessarily through the design of the product. So yeah, very underestimated.
Yeah, and very interesting that as you mentioned again here, to stand out in the mind and instead of standing out on the shelf, and POS material helps with that. And when we talk about, let's say on the shelf and brick and mortar, how about online? How does online shopping influence packaging and how packaging should look like?
Yeah, online is a bit of a tougher area because when you think about online, you've got only one normally product you see, and you've got, well, not necessarily one product, you've got one SKU, and then it might have your competitors are all lined up next to it. Where on the shelf, you've got other things like if you've got a bigger range, you've got that advantage in store, but online, you might have your one facing, your competitor one facing, and or all your other competitors have one facing. Um, and because the packaging itself is generally smaller, you need to maybe look at when stuff is designed, how you can obviously go about that to maintain that familiarity. Because
Interesting.
if you might even take assets off, you might have two different designs. Remember, really, recognition is the most important, and familiarity is the most important thing to help make that decision. If someone sees a like color and a logo and maybe some type of other asset, and that represents the brand, that's all what you might need online. You might not need all those other different little things that could have an influence in the store because consumers aren't going to pick up the product. They can't. They can only see the front facing. So yeah, you might need two different designs. And I think there's a lot of research companies out there now that are looking at that in terms of how do things not necessarily stand out online and in store, but how do designs maybe differ between online and in store?
Will, we're nearing the end of our
Yeah.
session. Is there anything that you would still like to mention or that I forgot to ask you about?
Oh, I guess I'll talk about maybe some good and bad outcomes of redesign. So
Yes, very
just
good.
yeah, just if they've done maybe some research or been involved in some type of research or a redesign in the past, it will just give them some realistic expectations for maybe the next ones they do. But before I probably go into that, I'll just quickly say redesigning a brand is hard. If it was easy, everyone would be doing it, but sometimes it feels like everyone does it. But because you're making a change, naturally, whenever you make some change, you're going to decrease recognition. So it's hard to do a redesign just by itself and have this drastic increase in sales. So a good outcome of a redesign, obviously your sales don't go down or your
Yeah,
ROI or
yeah.
whatever your like whatever it is within your range it wants to be, but the actual design in itself. So not all the other things that might go in, what it actually means for design. So design perspective from a designer. If a designer was looking at this, they probably don't care too much about sales and things. They want to know what is a good outcome if I redesign it. So a good outcome is your recognition is maintained.
Mm-hmm.
So when you make that change, people can still recognize that this means you. Familiarity in terms of not just recognizing the product, but how people perceive that or make that link to the brand. That is actually maintained. If you're doing some type of shelf test, it doesn't necessarily disrupt purchase. So if you're looking at an old versus new design and that new design has the same purchase intent as the old one, but you're making that design for, okay, we want to now hopefully make it easier for someone to recognize our variant. That's a good outcome. Like it's maintained that purchase
That's
intention,
good to know.
but you've made that change. In terms of poorer outcomes, it's sometimes the opposite, but poorer outcomes can also mean if we've invested a lot in this redesign, and sometimes I see brands do quite radical changes, and then unfortunately those radical changes decrease that familiarity, and it kind of makes the problem worse.
Yes.
Because if you're
yes, yes.
suffering a bit, like your sales are going down, people aren't recognizing you, maybe a redesign isn't a solution to the problem. Maybe it's to do with like an outcome should have been, we might have just advertised more to create that awareness. So from my PhD, when we looked at redesign success, a redesign in itself, if someone's said their objective was to increase their sales, but their sales were on the decline, none of the 250 case studies that I looked at was able to reverse that trend. Unfortunately,
That's
if you're
very good to
on
know.
the way down, you make a change, maybe look at somewhere else to like kind of what's actually causing that. But yeah, you've got your good outcomes, I shouldn't say necessarily bad ones because it's hard to determine what a bad
Well, if your
outcome
sales
might be.
go down even faster, that's pretty bad. It shouldn't have happened in the first place, that redesign.
Yeah. Oh, exactly. It's kind of making the problem worse because unfortunately, if your bad outcome of your sales decreasing, if your sales are decreasing, unfortunately, it might be something else. It might be like the marketing budget might not be there. We could have an awareness issue. It might be distribution somewhere is a problem. And if we start changing the design, we're then creating competition with, I guess, buyers in their minds to be like, well, now it's different. It's not going to stand out in our mind. And we're creating a bigger problem. So sometimes, yeah, as I said before, a redesign doesn't necessarily need to be the solution for everything, but it does have its place in the design space and it can be done well. I obviously focus a lot on negative outcomes with redesigns, but there is like a lot of positive ones that, like I've seen brands redesign, but it actually gets everyone talking about the product again. They were the market leader and for some reason they never did something. And then everyone starts talking about it. Retailers get on board. They do more point of sale. They do more ads. And it's a combination of that redesign by itself probably did nothing. But in terms of getting everyone interested again, that's what obviously created that success.
And then it's a B2B marketing tool, if you want to call it that way.
Yeah.
So that
Exactly
helps.
right.
So, Will, thank you so much.
No worries.
Thank you so much for all the great insights. And Dr. William Caruso, by your full title, for all the research you have done. Thanks so much for all your contributions to this field and to this session.